What happened to the footage of the Queen throwing a tennis racket at a fleeing Prince Philip? How did we never hear about Camilla's jewels being stolen? What cheeky way did King Charles come up with to cut short a meeting with his son Prince Harry? And does Charles have what it takes to save the monarchy, or will it be left to Prince William to rescue the Windsor legacy?
Constructed lie, while the clock was ticking and the evidence was piling up. This is the story they never wanted you to hear. And now that it is out, there is no putting it back. What you are about to find out changes everything. Andrew Albert Christian Edward was born on the 19th of February, 1960, making him the third child of Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip. What made his birth particularly notable was the fact that he was the first child born to a reign.
The former Prince Andrew once had a reputation as his mother's favourite. Emails released in the Epstein files show Queen Elizabeth supported him, even after photos emerged of him with his accuser, Virginia Giuffre. Here's Europe correspondent Mimi Becker.
Queen Elizabeth had already had 2 children before Andrew came along. Charles was born in 1948 and Anne in 1950, both arriving during an extraordinarily demanding period in the Queen's life. Her father, King George VI, had been seriously ill, and Elizabeth had been carrying out many of his duties on his behalf. When he died in February 1952, she was suddenly thrust into the role of monarch at just 25 years old. The coronation followed in 1953, and almost immediately after, she embarked on extensive tours of Commonwealth countries as their head of state. It was, by any measure, an overwhelming time. The demands on her were enormous, and the reality is that her 2 eldest children grew up during a period when their mother was still finding her footing as queen. By the time Andrew was born in 1960 and his younger brother Edward in 1964, the situation had changed considerably. The early turbulence had settled. The monarchy had found its rhythm. Elizabeth and Philip had more time available to them as parents, and by most accounts, both Andrew and Edward benefited from that shift in a way that Charles and Anne simply hadn't been able to. There was more presence, more stability, and more ordinary family life than had been possible in those earlier years. It was within that context that Andrew grew up as what many described as his mother's favourite child. Whether that label is entirely accurate is hard to say with certainty, but there is a reasonable case for understanding why people drew that conclusion. Andrew made his mother laugh. He lived close to her. He spent a great deal of time with her in a way that his siblings did not, particularly as they got older and their own lives took them in different directions. There was a closeness between them, a genuine mother and son bond that was visible to those who worked within the royal household. Some who observed the family dynamic from the inside have suggested that it wasn't so much favoritism in a deliberate sense, but rather the natural result of circumstance. He was simply around more, and that proximity bred a particular warmth between them. Growing up as a prince, and particularly as the son of one of the most powerful women in the world, Andrew was surrounded by deference and privilege from his earliest years. He attended Heatherdown Preparatory School and later Gordonstown in Scotland, the same school his father and brother Charles had attended. He then went on to study at Lakefield College School in Canada. By the time he was a young man, he had the confidence, and some would say the arrogance, that often comes with a life lived in the upper reaches of society. People who encountered him during his younger years and throughout his time as a working royal have consistently described a man with a strong sense of entitlement, someone who expected to be treated a certain way and had little patience for those who didn't meet that expectation. Staff who worked with him, people who were behind the scenes at various royal engagements and charitable events, often described a similar experience. He was rude to people he considered beneath him. He didn't treat those around him well, unless they happened to be someone of equivalent or higher social standing, or a woman he was romantically interested in. Those working in a support capacity, whether in embassies, behind the scenes at charity events, or as part of his household staff, frequently found him dismissive and difficult. It is striking that it is very hard to find anyone who worked closely with him and came away describing him as a warm, decent, or inspiring person to be around. Despite these qualities, or perhaps in spite of them, Andrew managed for a long time to maintain a public image that was considerably more favourable than the private reality. He was good at presenting a different face to the world. There was a charm offensive available to him when he wanted to use it, a kind of surface-level affability that could be convincing enough if you weren't on the receiving end of his less agreeable qualities. He gave the impression of being a jolly, approachable royal, which was enough to keep the public broadly on his side for years. That public goodwill reached its peak in 1982 during the Falklands War. Andrew served as a helicopter pilot with the Royal Navy, flying Sea King helicopters during the conflict. He was actively involved in combat operations and by all accounts conducted himself with genuine bravery. Flying helicopters in a war zone is not a symbolic gesture. It is dangerous, demanding, and requires real courage. Whatever one thinks of Andrew as a person, his service during the Falklands is not something that can be reasonably dismissed. He put himself in harm's way at a time when the outcome of the conflict was far from certain, and that earned him a level of respect that felt entirely justified. When the task force returned home, the footage and photographs of Andrew stepping off the ship with a red rose between his teeth became one of the defining images of that period. The Queen was there to greet him. The media were captivated. Here was this young, good-looking prince, a war hero with genuine military credentials, arriving home in what felt like a moment of national relief and celebration. His brother Charles had even remarked at the time that Andrew had the looks of a young Robert Redford. The press loved him, the public loved him. For a brief, uncomplicated moment, Andrew was exactly what the royal family hoped its members would be: brave, dutiful, and inspiring. That version of Andrew, the dashing naval officer and Falklands veteran, was the high point. It was the moment where his potential seemed most real, where the gap between what he could have been and what he eventually became was still wide open. Everything that followed would gradually close that gap, not in the direction of fulfillment, but in the direction of disappointment, scandal, and ultimately disgrace. After the war, Andrew returned to his role within the Navy and continued his military career. He eventually retired with the rank of commander, a respectable rank, but not a particularly distinguished one for a man of his position and the length of time he served. 20 years in the Royal Navy, and he progressed only so far. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his life. Opportunity was there, but the follow-through rarely matched the expectation. Alongside his naval career, Andrew also had to navigate the reality of his place in the line of succession. For many years, he was second in line to the throne after Charles. But as Charles married and had children, and as William and Harry were born, Andrew was pushed further and further down the line. He was never seriously expected to become king, but that shift in status, from being close to the throne to becoming increasingly peripheral, was something he apparently found very difficult to accept. People who knew him during this period have described a man who continued to regard himself as deeply important, even as the circumstances around him told a different story. He never quite came to terms with being what royal insiders sometimes call the spare. That inability to fully accept his own diminishing relevance, combined with the sense of entitlement that had been with him since childhood, would shape everything that came next. The foundations for everything that followed, the questionable associations, the poor judgment, the scandals, were all, in some ways, laid during these years, in the gap between who Andrew thought he was and the reality of his situation. Following his years in the Royal Navy, Prince Andrew found himself in a position that many in his situation might have struggled with. The structure and purpose that military life provides had gone, and in its place was something far less defined. He was a senior member of the royal family, expected to carry out engagements and represent the monarchy, but without a clear or particularly meaningful role to anchor himself to. He had the title, the residences, the staff, and the lifestyle, but the substance of what he was actually supposed to be doing with all of it was harder to pin down. For a man who placed enormous value on status and on being seen as important, that ambiguity was uncomfortable. In 2001, that changed, at least on the surface, when the British government appointed Andrew as the United Kingdom's Special Representative for International Trade and Investment. The role was commonly referred to as Special Trade Envoy, and on paper it was a genuinely useful one. The idea was straightforward enough. Andrew would use his position as a member of the royal family to open doors for British businesses abroad, to facilitate conversations at the highest levels in countries where that kind of royal connection carried real weight. In certain parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, where ruling families and heads of state are often one and the same, sending a member of the British royal family to represent commercial interests was a smart piece of diplomacy. Politicians and government ministers are one thing, but a prince is something else entirely. He could get into rooms that others simply could not. And to give credit where it is due, there were occasions when that approach worked. Andrew did make connections and did open doors that contributed to British business interests abroad. There were deals facilitated and relationships established that might not have happened through conventional diplomatic channels. The role had a logic to it, and in the right circumstances, Andrew could be effective. He was engaging when he wanted to be, and the prestige of his position did the heavy lifting in many of the more formal settings he found himself in. But problems began to emerge fairly quickly, and they were problems that spoke directly to the character issues that had been present throughout his life. The job was intended to be about promoting British trade. It was funded, at least in part, by the taxpayer, and it came with the expectation that Andrew would conduct himself accordingly. Instead, he began to treat the role as something closer to a personal perk. He travelled extensively, far more than the job strictly required, accumulating an extraordinary number of air miles in the process. It was this habit that earned him the nickname that would follow him for years afterwards, Air Miles Andy. The name stuck because it captured something real about the way he operated. The travel was lavish, the accommodation was first class, and the expenses were significant. More telling than the volume of travel was what he was reportedly doing on some of these trips. There were accounts of Andrew bringing his golf clubs along on official journeys, using time that was ostensibly set aside for trade-related work to play golf instead. That might sound like a relatively minor indiscretion in isolation, but it illustrated a broader attitude that those around him had been observing for years. The rules that applied to everyone else simply did not seem to apply to him, or at least that was the way he behaved. The taxpayer was effectively subsidizing his leisure activities while he was supposed to be representing British commercial interests. It was the kind of behavior that, once it became known, was always going to attract criticism. His conduct in the countries he visited also left something to be desired. Embassies that were required to support his visits and provide logistical assistance reportedly found him extremely difficult to deal with. The issue, as described by those familiar with the situation, was one of basic misunderstanding about who was actually working for whom. Andrew apparently treated embassy staff as though they were there to serve him personally, as extensions of his own household, rather than as representatives of the British government going about their own work. Embassies are not, of course, personal retinues for visiting royals. They exist to serve the interests of the British government and the British people. That distinction appeared to be lost on Andrew, and the friction it created left a lasting impression on the people who had to deal with him. At the same time, his social life and his choice of associates were beginning to attract a different kind of attention. Andrew had always been drawn to wealth. Those who observed him closely during this period have described a man who was almost visibly attracted to money, to the lifestyle it represented, and to the people who had it. He enjoyed the trappings of enormous wealth in a way that went beyond a simple appreciation for comfort. It was more fundamental than that. The access, the luxury, the sense of being connected to people at the very top of the financial world, all of it appealed to him deeply. For someone who had grown up in palaces and been given almost everything he could want, it was a striking hunger to have. It was within this context that Andrew first encountered Jeffrey Epstein. The two were introduced in the early 1990s through Ghislaine Maxwell, a British socialite, and the daughter of the media mogul Robert Maxwell. Maxwell and Andrew had known each other for some time before she brought Epstein into the picture, and the introduction proved to be one of the most consequential moments of Andrew's life, though he could not have known that at the time, or perhaps chose not to think about it. Epstein was, by any measure, an extraordinary figure in the world of extreme wealth. He had a private island in the Caribbean, a townhouse in Manhattan that was one of the largest private residences in New York, a mansion in Palm Beach, and a vast network of connections that stretched across finance, politics, academia, and entertainment. For Andrew, who was so drawn to money and the world it opened up, Epstein must have seemed like the ultimate insider. Here was a man who appeared to exist at the very center of a certain kind of elite world, and who seemed to have unlimited resources and unlimited access to go with it. What followed was a friendship, or at least a close association, that deepened over the years to a degree that became increasingly difficult to explain away as casual acquaintance. Epstein was not simply someone Andrew bumped into occasionally at social events. He was at Royal Ascot. He attended parties at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle. He stayed at Sandringham. These were not peripheral appearances. These were the kinds of access that only comes with a genuine degree of trust and closeness. Andrew had clearly opened those doors himself, and the level of access Epstein enjoyed through that connection was significant. There were also accounts from staff at various properties during this period that painted an uncomfortable picture of the atmosphere surrounding Andrew's private life. Stories emerged about the kind of environment that existed at gatherings Andrew hosted, details that suggested a lifestyle that sat uneasily alongside his public role as a working royal. Those who were present at some of these occasions have described scenes that would have been deeply uncomfortable for the royal family had they become widely known at the time. Throughout all of this, the palace was not entirely unaware that Andrew's associations were becoming a problem. Those responsible for managing the royal family's public image were conscious that the people Andrew was surrounding himself with were not the kind of company that reflected well on the monarchy. Attempts were made to raise concerns, to suggest that certain relationships were unwise, to encourage Andrew to be more careful. But Andrew was not a man who responded well to being told what to do. He pushed back, dismissed the concerns, and carried on doing exactly as he pleased. He had been getting away with it for most of his life, and there was little reason, in his own mind, to think that would change. The trade envoy role eventually came to an end in 2011, brought down not by the Gulf trips or the embassy complaints or even the extravagant travel, but by something far more serious. That year, the full extent of his relationship with Jeffrey Epstein became public, and with it came the first photographs that would prove impossible to explain away. The image of Andrew walking in Central Park with Epstein, taken after Epstein had already been convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor in Florida, landed like a grenade. The question of why a senior member of the British royal family was socializing with a convicted sex offender, not before the conviction but after it, was one that demanded an answer. It was the moment that the story stopped being a background concern and became something the palace could no longer manage quietly. The years of poor judgment, questionable associations, and a fundamental belief that the rules did not apply to him had finally produced consequences that were impossible to contain. The publication of that photograph in 2011 marked a turning point that could not be undone. Andrew had been photographed walking through Central Park in New York with Jeffrey Epstein. just days after Epstein had been released from a prison sentence in Florida. That sentence related to charges of soliciting prostitution from a minor, meaning that by the time Andrew was seen strolling alongside him in broad daylight, Epstein was already a convicted sex offender. The image was not ambiguous. It was not a case of two people caught in the same room at a large event. It was a leisurely walk, side by side, through one of the most photographed public spaces in the world. The implications were immediate, and they were serious. For the Palace communications team, it was the beginning of a prolonged and exhausting crisis. The photograph was published, republished, and discussed relentlessly. Every time it seemed as though the story might be losing momentum, something else would emerge to bring it back to the front pages. Those working to manage the fallout at the time have described the experience as dealing with a continuous stream of problems, one fire put out only for another to start somewhere else. It was relentless, and unlike many royal controversies that fade within a week or two, this one showed no sign of going away. As a direct result of the photograph and the scrutiny it brought, Andrew lost his position as the UK's special trade envoy. The role that he had held for a decade, the job that had given him a degree of purpose and taken him around the world meeting heads of state and business leaders, was taken away from him. It was the first significant professional consequence of his association with Epstein, and it signalled that the usual protections surrounding his position were beginning to wear thin. The loss stung. By all accounts, Andrew genuinely enjoyed the role, the travel, the access, the sense of being at the centre of things. Having it removed was a concrete demonstration that his behaviour had costs. But the story did not end there. Over the years that followed, more details continued to emerge about the nature of Andrew's relationship with Epstein and the world Epstein had built around himself. Epstein's network, it became increasingly clear, was not simply a collection of wealthy and well-connected people who happened to socialize together. It was something far more troubling. Allegations of the systematic trafficking and sexual abuse of young women and girls were building into a picture that was deeply disturbing, and Andrew's position within that social circle was attracting ever more uncomfortable questions. One of those questions came in the form of Virginia Giuffre, an American woman who alleged that she had been trafficked by Epstein and that she had been directed to have sexual relations with Andrew on multiple occasions. She was specific about the details, specific about the locations, and specific about the timeline. A photograph emerged that appeared to show Andrew with his arm around a young Giuffre, with Ghislaine Maxwell visible in the background. Andrew denied that any of this had taken place. He denied the allegations completely and maintained that denial consistently. But the photograph existed, and Giuffre's account was detailed and consistent, and the pressure on Andrew and on the palace to address the situation directly continued to grow. After Epstein died, in August 2019, a New York jail cell, while awaiting trial on federal sex trafficking charges, the calls for Andrew to come forward and publicly address his connection to Epstein became impossible to ignore. Public opinion was hardening, the media coverage was intense. The question being asked, loudly and repeatedly, was simple. If Andrew had nothing to hide, why wasn't he saying so clearly and on the record? What happened next is widely regarded as one of the most catastrophic decisions in the history of royal public relations. Andrew agreed to sit down for a lengthy television interview with journalist Emily Maitlis for the BBC's Newsnight programme. The interview was broadcast in November 2019, and what followed was, by almost any measure, a disaster of the first order. The decision to do the interview at all was questionable. Newsnight is not a soft platform. It is one of the BBC's flagship current affairs programmes, known for rigorous and often uncomfortable questioning. Emily Maitlis in particular had a well-established reputation for not letting interviewees off the hook. If the intention was to rehabilitate Andrew's image and present him as a credible, sympathetic figure, Newsnight was about the worst possible venue for the attempt. a more carefully managed appearance on a program with a less adversarial format might at least have given him the opportunity to come across as human and remorseful. Newsnight was always going to be a different kind of conversation entirely. The interview began with Andrew attempting to explain and contextualize his relationship with Epstein. He acknowledged that the friendship had been a mistake, but the way he framed that acknowledgement was clumsy at best. He described a visit to Epstein's Manhattan townhouse in December 2010, after Epstein's conviction, saying that he had gone there specifically to end the friendship in person because it was the honorable thing to do. The idea that staying at a convicted sex offender's home for several days was the appropriate way to draw a line under a friendship struck many viewers as difficult to accept. But it was some of the other details in the interview that lodged themselves most firmly in the public consciousness. Andrew made a claim that on the night Virginia Giuffre alleged one of the incidents had taken place, he had in fact been at a Pizza Express restaurant in Woking with his daughter. He presented this as a specific, verifiable alibi, the kind of detail that suggested a clear and reliable memory of that particular evening. The choice of Pizza Express in Woking as an anchor point for a royal alibi struck many people as deeply unusual, and the very specificity of it, rather than lending credibility, seemed to raise more questions than it answered. He also made a comment about sweating, or rather about his inability to do so. Giuffre had described Andrew as having been sweaty on the evening in question. Andrew's response was to say that he had a medical condition at the time that meant he did not sweat, a condition he suggested had been brought on by the stress of combat during the Falklands War. The claim was met with widespread skepticism, and photographs subsequently emerged, appearing to show Andrew sweating on various public occasions. Whether or not the specific medical claim had any basis, the way he delivered it, calmly and matter-of-factly, landed badly with audiences who were already struggling to find him believable. Perhaps the most damaging moment of the entire interview came near its close. Mateless gave Andrew the opportunity to express sympathy for the victims of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse. It was an open moment, a chance to step outside the defensive posture he had maintained throughout and simply acknowledge the suffering of real people who had been through genuinely terrible experiences. He declined it. Asked whether there was anything he wished to say that had been left unsaid, his response was essentially that he could not think of anything. No expression of compassion for the victims, no acknowledgement of the pain involved, nothing. It was a moment that communicated something about Andrew's priorities and his self-awareness that no amount of subsequent clarification could undo. The public reaction to the interview was swift and overwhelmingly negative. It had the opposite effect to the one intended. Rather than drawing a line under the story or presenting Andrew as a credible and sympathetic figure, it had deepened the crisis considerably. Within days, a string of organizations and companies that had been associated with Andrew's charitable work began distancing themselves. His pitch at Palace Initiative, a project he was genuinely proud of that helped young entrepreneurs develop their business ideas, hemorrhaged supporters rapidly. Dozens of organizations withdrew their involvement in quick succession, a visible and public demonstration of how badly the interview had gone. Andrew's position as a working royal became untenable. Shortly after the interview aired, it was announced that he would be stepping back from his public duties. The announcement was framed carefully, but the reality was clear enough. A senior member of the royal family had appeared on national television and failed to adequately address serious allegations, had said nothing meaningful about the victims of a prolific sex offender he had been close to, and had offered explanations that much of the public simply did not find convincing. Continuing as though nothing had changed was not an option. His military affiliations and royal patronages, accumulated over decades, were stripped away. The charities and organizations he had been associated with severed their ties. The professional and public infrastructure of his life as a working royal was dismantled in a relatively short space of time. For a man who had spent his entire life surrounded by the markers of his status and importance. The speed and completeness of that dismantling must have been deeply shocking, even if, to outside observers, it appeared entirely inevitable. What the Newsnight interview ultimately revealed was not just poor preparation or bad advice, though there was clearly plenty of both. It revealed something about Andrew himself, about the degree to which he had surrounded himself with people who told him what he wanted to hear, about the extent to which he genuinely believed he could walk into one of the most scrutinized media environments in British broadcasting and emerge with his reputation intact. The confidence required to make that calculation in the face of everything that was already known and already in the public domain suggested a man who had still not fully grasped the seriousness of the situation he was in, or who had decided that the usual rules simply did not apply to him. It was, in many respects, the same mistake he had been making his entire life. The fallout from the Newsnight interview had been severe, but it was not the end of the story. If anything, it was the point at which the story entered its most consequential phase. The consequences that followed over the next few years were more sweeping and more permanent than anything that had come before. And they involved not just Andrew's public role, but his relationship with the institution he had been born into and the family that had protected him for so long. Queen Elizabeth had always maintained a complicated position when it came to her son. Those close to the situation have described a woman who was genuinely torn, who understood on some level the damage that Andrew's behaviour was doing to the monarchy, but who also could not entirely separate herself from the instinct of a mother defending her child. She had, after the Newsnight interview, acted decisively enough. The stripping of his patronages and his removal from public duties were significant steps. But there were those around her who felt that more needed to be done, and sooner. In early 2022, the situation came to a head in a way that could not be managed quietly. Virginia Giuffre's civil lawsuit against Andrew in the United States was progressing, and Andrew had indicated that he intended to fight it. The prospect of a serving member of the British royal family being questioned under oath in an American courtroom, with all the detail and publicity that would entail, was alarming to those responsible for protecting the monarchy. Adding to the difficulty was the timing. 2022 was the year of the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, a celebration of 70 years on the throne. The idea of that milestone being overshadowed by a civil trial in New York involving allegations of sexual abuse was simply unacceptable. Andrew was summoned to Windsor Castle to meet his mother. The meeting was a formal and serious one. He arrived with a friend and a lawyer, both of whom were made to wait outside while Andrew faced the Queen alone, accompanied by two senior courtiers who, by accounts of those familiar with the situation, had little affection or respect for him. The message delivered in that room was unambiguous. If Andrew continued to fight the civil case, the remaining titles and privileges he still held would be removed. He was, in effect, being told that the institution would not stand behind him if he chose to pursue that path. He was on his own. Shortly afterwards, a settlement was reached with Virginia Giuffre. Andrew did not admit liability, and he has continued to deny her allegations to this day. But the settlement itself and the circumstances surrounding it made it very difficult for him to present the outcome as any kind of vindication. The remaining titles were stripped. His HRH status was removed in an official capacity. He was no longer a working royal in any meaningful sense. The process that had begun with the Newsnight interview had now reached something close to its conclusion, at least while the Queen was still alive. Queen Elizabeth died in September 2022. With her passing went the last significant source of protection that Andrew had within the family. Whatever her private feelings about her son, she had consistently refused to go as far as those around her believed she should. She had, as some have put it, a blind spot where Andrew was concerned, a willingness to believe his account of events and to extend to him a degree of loyalty that his behaviour had not earned. After her death, that protection was gone. King Charles and Prince William moved quickly. The atmosphere around Andrew changed almost immediately. A damning email emerged, uncovered and reported on, in which Andrew had apparently written to Epstein after his 2010 conviction, offering words of support and solidarity. The email was significant not just because of what it said, but because of what it proved. It demonstrated that Andrew had maintained a warm and supportive relationship with Epstein well after the conviction, directly contradicting the version of events he had presented in the Newsnight interview, where he had suggested the relationship had been conducted at a distance and eventually ended on his own initiative. For Charles and William, it was confirmation of what many had long suspected. Andrew had not been fully honest, not with the public, not with the media, and apparently not with his own family. William in particular had made his feelings known. His view, shared by those familiar with his thinking on the matter, was that any continued association with Andrew represented a stain on the monarchy and on the work being done to maintain public confidence in the institution. The message was clear, and this time there was no one with the authority or the inclination to override it. Andrew was stripped of the title of prince. It was a step that would have been almost unthinkable during the Queen's lifetime. To remove a title that someone was born with, a designation that had been theirs from birth, was an extraordinary act. But it happened, and the speed with which it was implemented after the email became public suggested that the decision had not been made lightly or impulsively. It was the culmination of a long process, and it represented a final, formal break between Andrew and the working royal identity he had clung to throughout his adult life. The life Andrew now leads is a markedly reduced one by any measure. Royal Lodge, the large grace and favour residence in Windsor Great Park that had been his home for around 25 years, became the subject of an ongoing dispute as pressure mounted for him to vacate it. His charitable work had largely ceased. His business connections had dried up. The social world that had surrounded him, the dinners, the engagements, the sense of being at the centre of things, had contracted enormously. Reports have suggested that his relationship with his daughters has become strained, and that his circle of genuine friends and supporters has grown very small. Whether Andrew's choices ultimately damaged the Queen's legacy is a question that does not have a simple answer. The Queen was, by almost any assessment, one of the most respected and admired heads of state of the 20th century. Her reputation was built on decades of service, consistency, and a genuine sense of duty that was visible in almost everything she did. The Andrew situation was, for most of her reign, a persistent background problem, rather than something that fundamentally altered how the world saw her. She had enough credit, as some have put it, to absorb the damage without it defining her legacy. But it is also true that the decisions she made, particularly her reluctance to act more decisively in the earlier stages of the scandal, left unfinished business that others had to deal with after she was gone. The question of whether she was misled by her son, whether she chose not to see what was in front of her, or whether she simply could not bring herself to take the final steps against someone she loved, is one that historians and royal observers will continue to debate. What is not in doubt is that the matter was not resolved on her watch, and that the task of drawing a definitive line under it fell to the next generation. Andrew, for his part, continues to deny the allegations made against him. He has never been charged with any criminal offence. He maintains that he is innocent, and that position has not changed despite everything that has happened. But innocence or guilt, in a legal sense, is not the only measure by which a public life is judged. The choices he made across several decades, the associations he kept, the way he conducted himself in the interview that was supposed to clear his name, and the behaviour that stretched back long before Epstein ever entered the picture, all of it contributed to an outcome that was, in many ways, entirely of his own making.